close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sound of waves breaking against the black cliffs of an ancient shore. The wind smells of salt and stone, and somewhere beneath that endless sea, something ancient is stirring. Tonight, we journey back far beyond the comfort of modern reason, into a world where gods shaped fate, and a single gaze could turn flesh to stone. This is the entire story of Medusa, told as the Greeks once whispered it, in a voice meant to soothe, yet haunt the edges of your dreams. So, sit back, let the world outside fade, and listen. Long before her name became a curse, Medusa was said to be beautiful. So beautiful, in fact, that even the gods noticed. She was no monster then. She was mortal, a priestess of Athena. Her hair gleamed like polished bronze beneath temple torches, and her devotion was her pride. But as with all myths, beauty rarely remains untouched. Some stories say she was loved by Poseidon, god of the sea. Others say she was hunted by him. The truth, perhaps, was lost in the waves. What remains is this: in Athena's sacred temple, the sea god and the mortal met, and the air grew heavy with divine trespass. The marble walls echoed with the sound of Athena's anger, and from that moment on, Medusa's fate was sealed. The goddess who once blessed her now cursed her. Her skin turned pale, her eyes burned with divine fury, and her beautiful hair, writhed into serpents that hissed like steam escaping the earth. The world would forever see her as a monster, but myths, like dreams, have layers. Was Medusa truly a villain or a victim of divine pride? Was she punished for defiling the temple, or merely for being too beautiful for the gods to resist? As the centuries passed, poets and sculptors would argue endlessly, their chisel marks echoing through history. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, those same questions linger in the air, soft and heavy, like the sea mist over ancient stones. Who was Medusa before the curse? And what really lies behind the eyes that could turn men to stone? The waves will answer soon. But not yet. Before Medusa was mortal, before temples, curses, or even the Olympian gods, there was the sea. Dark, endless, and alive with things both beautiful and terrible. From its depths rose to beings older than time itself. Phorcys and Ceto, the ancient parents of monsters. They were not evil, merely ancient, their bodies shaped by the same chaos that formed the stars. Their domain lay beneath the waves, where light fades and strange creatures flicker in the dark. From them came beings that the world was never meant to seethe: the Gree, the dragon-laden, and finally the three Gorgon sisters, Steno, Euryale, and Medusa. Steno, the strong, whose rage was said to echo through eternity. Euryale, the wide-leaping, whose cries could shatter stone. And Medusa, the youngest, the mortal, the only one destined to die. Yet in the beginning, they were not monsters. They were guardians, watchers of the threshold between the living and the divine. Ancient sailors feared their names, but they also carved their faces on ships, shields, and temples, believing that their terrible beauty could drive away evil. It was not until the world of gods began to rise that the Gorgons were cast into shadow. The Olympians brought order to chaos, light to darkness, and, with that light, came fear of what lay beyond it. The Gorgons, born from the deep, represented that forgotten world. Some scholars believe that Medusa's later curse was a rewriting, a way to tame the ancient feminine power that once ruled the oceans. Others suggest her mortality made her dangerous, because it made her relatable. A monster that could die was one step too close to being human. In the temples of early Greece, her face appeared everywhere, on shields, coins, vases, even on the walls of homes. Her image, with wide eyes and a serpent crown, wasn't meant to horrify, but to protect. The Greeks called it apotropaic, a charm to ward off harm. Her fangs and serpents were not symbols of evil, but of power, the power to frighten away darkness. So when you see her face carved in stone, remember, once she was worshipped. Once her image guarded the sacred. Somewhere between the crash of waves and the whisper of the wind, Medusa was still divine. But time, as always, would twist her story. From guardian to monster, from worshipped to feared, and her fall would begin with the sea's oldest god, the one who could not resist her. It began, as many tragedies do, with beauty that caught the eye of a god. Medusa's devotion to Athena made her radiant in ways the divine often found irresistible. Her hair shone like gold under the sun that filtered through marble columns. Her eyes reflected the calm of the sea on a windless day. Yet that same beauty drew the attention of Poseidon, lord of the deeper, being as unpredictable and vast as the waters he ruled. The Greeks said his presence could be felt before it was seen, the sudden stillness of the air, the scent of salt thickening in the temple halls, and the faint rumble beneath the earth as though the sea itself were holding its breath. Some say Poseidon loved her. Others say he claimed her out of wrath or envy for Athena's favor. But all accounts agree the temple of the goddess became a place of violation. The sacred was defiled. Marble floors that had known only prayer now trembled with divine fury. Athena, the virgin goddess of wisdom, could not strike Poseidon her uncle, her equal among the gods. Divine law forbade it. So her anger turned toward Medusa. Mortality made her an easier target. One version whispers that Athena's punishment was not wrath, but protection, that she gave Medusa her monstrous form to shield her from further harm. Another says it was cruelty, born of divine pride, meant to erase the shame of desecration. The truth lies buried in centuries of retelling. What is certain is this: the temple fell silent after that day, and Medusa was never seen as human again. Her eyes no longer reflected the calm of the sea, they were the sea, shifting, cold, and full of hidden storms. The serpents that grew from her scalp hissed softly, like waves breaking over stones. Her face became both a curse and a warning, a reminder of divine injustice that could not be undone. In the quiet after Poseidon's visit, Athena's temple remained pure, but only in appearance. Beneath the marble and incense lingered a deeper corruption, the memory of a mortal girl who had caught the eye of a god. And as the centuries passed, mortals would tell her story again and again, each version reshaping her into something the gods could never control. Yet one question remained: did the curse truly destroy her? Or did it make her powerful enough to defy the heavens themselves? Far from the marble cities of men and the golden halls of Olympus, there existed an island shrouded in silencer, place the waves avoided, where even birds refused to fly overhead. It was there that Medusa, now cursed and alone, made her reluctant home. The air was heavy with salt and sorrow. The ground was grey and uneven, carved by centuries of storms and divine abandonment. The rocks themselves seemed alive, their shapes twisted into forms that whispered of suffering. To those who dared to approach, the island appeared lifeless, until they saw the statues. They stood scattered across the barren land, warriors, sailors, wanderers each, one frozen in the final instant of terror. Some with swords raised, others in mid-scream, their faces locked in expressions of disbelief. These were not crafted monuments, but living beings turned to stone by a single glance. The wind howled through their hollow mouths, creating a low, mournful sound that carried across the water like a dirge. Legends say Medusa wept when she first realized her power. She tried to hide, covering her face, begging the gods to take back what they had given. But the serpents hissed in reply, their movements restless, aware of the hunger that now lived within her curse. Isolation became her only sanctuary. Each day she wandered among her petrified visitors, the sun glinting off their stone eyes, the sound of her footsteps echoing across the island like distant thunder. Some believe she spoke to them, to the statues that surrounded her, that she gave names to the faces, remembered their stories, apologized for what she had done. Yet even in her solitude, she remained a magnet for obsession. The promise of glory, of slaying the monster and claiming her head, drew countless men to her shore. None ever returned. Their ships, now stone, stood eternally on the coastline, sails forever frozen in the wind. Over time, Medusa's island became less a place and more a legend of realm between life and death, guarded by eyes that saw too much. And in that endless exile, her humanity slowly faded, replaced by something deeper, quieter, more enduring. She was no longer merely cursed. She had become a force of nature itself. But beyond the horizon, destiny stirred her. Hero was coming, guided by gods who saw her not as a woman, nor even as a monster, but as a test of what mankind could overcome. Across the glittering Aegean Sea, where the sun melted into the horizon like spilled gold, a name began to echo across kingdoms: Perseus, son of Zeus, born of prophecy and raised for glory. His story, like Medusa's, began in fear and divine interference. Cast into the sea as an infant, he survived by the will of gods who always seemed to weave human fate into their endless games. By the time Perseus grew to manhood, the gods had already chosen his path. A cruel king named Polydectes demanded an impossible gift from him, the head of Medusa, the monster whose gaze could turn life into stone. It was not a quest of honor, but of deceit, meant to rid the world of a potential rival. Yet the gods, in their strange amusement, armed Perseus for the task. Athena lent him her shield, polished to a mirror's gleam. Hermes gave him winged sandals to carry him through the sky. Hades offered his helm of invisibility and a curved blade sharp enough to sever divine flesh. Armed with gifts from the heavens, Perseus set out not merely to slay a creature, but to face something ancient, something humanity was never meant to see. The air grew colder the closer he flew to Medusa's island. The ocean below turned black, reflecting nothing. When he landed upon the cursed shore, silence greeted him. Not even the waves dared to crash against the stones. The air felt heavy, as if the world itself held its breath. Statues of men stood before him, boders trapped in their final struggle, their eyes wide with terror. And in their midst, somewhere deeper in the shadows, the creature stirred. Perseus did not look directly. He used Athena's shield as his guide, moving with the patience of a hunter and the dread of a man who knew one wrong glance meant death. The faint sound of hissing filled the air, slow, deliberate, and intelligent. Then a voice, low, wounded. "Human, why have you come?" she asked. It was not the voice of a monster, but of a woman long forgotten by mercy. In that moment, Perseus hesitated. For all the divine purpose behind his mission, standing there on that island of stone, he felt the weight of something no god could explain: pity. But the gods had no room for pity. and fate never paused for understanding. The cavern where Medusa dwelled was alive with echoes, the soft slither of serpents, the whisper of the sea seeping through cracks in the stone, the occasional thud of something falling and breaking against the cold earth. Perseus moved slowly, every heartbeat loud enough to betray him. The shield in his hand reflected the world behind him in ghostly fragments, its surface trembling in the faint torchlight. He had been told not to look upon her face. To see her directly was to surrender his soul to stone. So he watched her through the mirror, catching only glimpses of motion, flicker of scales, the curve of a shadow, the faint shimmer of gold in the darkness. The air was thick with tension, heavy with centuries of sorrow. Medusa's breath could be heard now, deep and slow, the breath of something not asleep but waiting. Her voice, when it came again, carried no hatred, only weariness. Another one sent by them. She murmured, "How many more must fall before the gods are satisfied?" Her words filled the cavern like smoke, curling around Perseus's thoughts. He did not answer. He could not. For even her voice had power. It carried fragments of her past, the echo of the woman she once was. The snakes hissed softly, warning her, sensing danger. They whispered like wind through dead leaves. Perseus crept closer, his reflection shimmering in the bronze shield. He saw her then, not as a monster, but as something tragic, her hair a living crown of serpents, her eyes glowing faintly, not with fury, but with despair. Her face, reflected in the shield, was beautiful in a terrible, mournful way. She looked less like a creature of evil and more like a forgotten goddess punished for her very existence. The moment hung between them a silence, so complete it felt sacred. Then the sword moved. Swift, sure, guided by gods and fear alike. The strike was almost merciful. The serpents screamed, thrashing wildly, their voices merging into one long, piercing cry that seemed to shake the earth itself. And then there was nothing. Only silence and the sound of waves outside returning to life. Perseus stood still, breath shallow, staring at the reflection of what he had done. In the shield's gleam, her eyes were closed, not in rage, but in peace. The curse had ended, but something else had begun, a haunting that would follow him long after he left that island of stone. As Perseus stood amidst the silence, the air in the cavern began to change. The scent of salt and stone was replaced by something heavier, metallic, the smell of divine blood. From the neck of the fallen Gorgon, rivers of crimson light poured forth, glimmering like molten gold beneath his torch. It did not spill like mortal blood. It moved with purpose, rippling and shifting, as if alive with the will of the gods themselves. The ground trembled. The sea outside roared in sudden fury. From the glistening pool of Medusa's blood, two forms emerged, creatures of legend, born not of life, but of death. The first was Pegasus, the winged horse, pure white and radiant, his mane glittering like moonlight on water. With a thunderous cry, he spread his wings and leapt into the sky, breaking through the clouds with effortless grace. The second was Chrysaor, a warrior with a blade of gold, his eyes burning like fire. Both were said to be children of Poseidon and Medusa, born at the exact moment her curse ended. The paradox was almost divine. From her death came beauty and power beyond comprehension. Perseus could only watch, stunned, as the creatures vanished into the horizon, symbols of what the gods took and what they unknowingly gave back. The cavern grew quiet again. The head of Medusa lay still, her eyes closed, her face eerily calm, as if she had finally found peace in death. Perseus placed it carefully in a leather satchel, avoiding her gaze even now. The weight of it was immense, not just in form, but in meaning. He knew what he carried was more than a trophy. It was a weapon capable of stopping armies, a curse wrapped in divine tragedy. As he stepped out into the open air, the storm had passed. The island seemed almost asleep again, its stone figures now bathed in dawn's faint light. The silence no longer felt hostile, but mournful, and as Perseus took flight with his winged sandals, the sea below shimmered red with her fading memory. Far behind him, the island sank back into its eternal slumber, a graveyard of stone and sorrow, guarded by the wind and waves. But the gods were not yet finished. Medusa's death, they say, rippled through the heavens, stirring jealousies, awakenings, and consequences that even Perseus could not foresee. For every myth, like every curse, leaves behind an echo, and Medusa's had only just begun to speak. Perseus soared above the ocean, the wind biting at his face, the satchel heavy at his side. Within it, the severed head of Medusa lay wrapped in layers of cloth. Yet even through them, he could feel its presence live, aware, whispering faintly. At times, he thought he heard hissing, not from snakes, but from memory. The air around him seemed to pulse with an unseen rhythm, as though the head still carried breath. The winged sandals of Hermes glided effortlessly through the clouds. But Perseus could not escape the sense that he was being watched not by mortals, not even by gods, but by the very thing he had slain. The world beneath him stretched vast and endless. Silver seas, emerald islands, and the soft blue curve of the horizon. But beauty meant little when your shadow carried death. At night, he rested on distant shores, too afraid to sleep deeply. He would hear faint voices, Medusa's voice, soft, pleading, sometimes accusing. "You were chosen," she would whisper, "but not for glory." Perseus would wake, heart pounding, his hand gripping the hilt of the curved blade, staring into the darkness. The gods had given him the tools, but never the truth. What exactly had he destroyed? The woman in the cavern had not been a beast. Her words had not been rage, but resignation. Each time he thought of her, he saw her reflection in the shield knot, monstrous but mournful. The sea mist clung to him as he travelled, his thoughts haunted by that last breath she took. Yet fate drove him onward. The head of Medusa was not only proof of his victory, it was now his burden. He had become the keeper of a divine weapon, one that could command fear from kings and respect from gods. When he gazed upon the world below, he began to understand why they feared her. Power like that, the power to freeze life itself, was not meant to belong to mortals. And yet, here it was, swaying at his side, silent but eternal. The wind whispered her name as he flumed, a sour reminder that even in death she was not gone. She had merely changed form. The curse lived on, bound now not to her, but to him. And the further he flew, the clearer the truth became. He had not escaped the monster. He had become part of her story. As the days stretched on, Perseus's journey carried him far beyond the familiar waters of his homeland and into lands ruled by rumor and wind. One night, under a bruised purple sky where the stars trembled like scattered embers, he heard cries from the sea below. Following the sound, he descended toward a jagged coastline where waves crashed against black cliffs. And there, chained to a rock jutting from the water, was a woman Andromeda, her skin pale beneath the moonlight, her wrists bound in iron. Around her, the sea churned violently, as though the gods themselves were restless. From the depths emerged a monstrous shadow, enormous and ancient, its scales glinting like shards of obsidian. It was Cetus, sea serpent sent by Poseidon to punish her mother's pride. The creature's roar shook the air, the sound deep and hungry. Perseus hovered above, the head of Medusa slung at his side, the wind tugging at his cloak. The decision came not from reason, but instinct. He had been given death as a weapon, perhaps. Now he could use it to save life. As the beast lunged, Perseus reached into the satchel and withdrew the head. Even hidden behind the folds of cloth, the air turned to ice. The serpent's eyes met the impossible reflection, just one sand. The transformation began. Its body froze mid-roar, waves curling upward and turning to stone. The sea itself seemed to pause in awe. When it was over, the creature stood petrified, an eternal monument rising from the water like a twisted mountain. Perseus descended, unfastening Andromeda's chains. Her breath was shallow, her voice trembling as she spoke his name. She had heard of him, she said, the man who defeated the Gorgon. Yet when she looked at him, she did not see a hero. She saw a man haunted by what he carried. Together they gazed upon the lifeless sea monster, its face locked forever in terror. And for the first time, Perseus wondered if the head's power was mercy or madness. Andromeda took his hand, her touch grounding him in the world of the living. But even then, he could feel the faint pulse from within the satchel. Medusa's eyes were closed, yet her presence remained. The ocean was calm again, but inside Perseus, something deeper had begun to stir, a growing fear that no victory, no love could free him from what he had unleashed. The waves calmed, but the silence that followed was not peaceful, was a stillness that felt unnatural, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Perseus and Andromeda sailed away from the coast, the petrified remains of the sea serpent glistening behind them like a new island, its frozen body catching the first light of dawn. The seabirds circled it cautiously, unwilling to land. Perseus watched the stone creature fade into the mist, and in its expression, he thought he saw the same emptiness that haunted Medusa's victims. His heart felt heavy, the salt wind cutting across his face, as if to remind him he was still alive. But inside the satchel, the presence pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat that refused to die. Sometimes, when the ocean was quiet and the wind gentle, he could hear her whisper again, faint, sorrowful, like a prayer lost to time. "Do you understand now?" The words seemed to rise not from the head, but from somewhere deeper in his thoughts, in the places sleep could no longer reach. Andromeda slept peacefully beside him, her hair tangled from the sea breeze, her face soft and human. Perseus envied her rest. He no longer dreamed in color. His nights were filled with grey, with statues, with echoes of eyes that would not close. Each time he touched the satchel, he could feel the weight of it tugging at his soul. It was more than a trophy, it was a fragment of divine punishment, and it was changing him. The ship creaked and swayed gently, its sails glowing orange in the dying sun. He often found himself staring at the horizon, wondering where the line between hero and executioner truly began. The head of Medusa had saved him, saved Andromeda, yet every use of its power left another scar on his conscience. The gods had called it a gift, but he knew now it was something else, entirely a test. Perhaps, or a curse passed from one soul to another. And as night fell once more, and the sea stretched endlessly before him, Perseus understood what few ever did. The monsters of myth are not born, they are made, shaped by divine cruelty and human hands. Somewhere deep within the satchel, a faint hiss answered him, like the breath of the sea. It was not anger, it was remembrance. When Perseus and Andromeda finally reached the island of Seriphos, the air was thick with anticipation. Word of his return had already spread, the hero who had slain the Gorgon and tamed the sea. Yet beneath the surface of celebration lay something colder. The island had changed in his absence. King Polydex, who had once sent him on the impossible mission, now ruled with arrogance sharpened by power. His halls were filled with feasts, laughter, and false glory. Perseus felt no triumph entering them, only unease. Andromeda stood beside him, silent, her hand resting gently on his arm as they were summoned before the king. Polydex's eyes gleamed with mocking amusement. "So," he said, his voice rich with false kindness, "you claim to have done what no man could. You claim to hold the head of a god's monster." The courtiers laughed. The sound echoed through the marble chamber like the hiss of snakes. Perseus said nothing. He could see it now, the arrogance, the cruelty that had always lurked behind Polydex's smile. This was never about courage or destiny. It was about humiliation, about sending him to die. The king leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Show us then. Let us see this miracle of yours." The room fell still. Even the torches seemed to dim. Perseus hesitated, the weight of the satchel pressing against his side. He thought of Medusa's island, of the statues frozen in their final terror. He thought of her voice, low and broken, asking him why he had come. Then, slowly, without a word, he drew the head from the bag. Gasps filled the hall. Her eyes, even in death, glowed faintly, a reflection of divine sorrow. The air turned heavy. Those who met her gaze barely had time to scream. The transformation was swift, beautiful, and horrifying. Flesh hardened. Motion ceased. In moments, the laughter had ended, replaced by silence and stone. Polydex stood frozen on his throne, his expression locked in disbelief, his arrogance immortalized forever. Perseus lowered the head, his hand trembling. The hall was still. He had not sought revenge, but justice had found him all the same. And as he looked upon the field of stone figures, he realized the truth. Even in death, Medusa had power over kings. The curse he carried was not hers alone. It belonged now to all who thought themselves above consequence. The hall of Polydex was now a mausoleum. The air hung heavy with the scent of dust and marble, the echoes of laughter and cruelty frozen in an eternal moment. The torches flickered against the faces of the newly petrified courtiers, guards, and the king himself, immortalized in their final breath. Perseus stood among them, sword lowered, his reflection caught in the cold sheen of their eyes. Andromeda stayed at the entrance, unable to move, her hand pressed to her mouth as though afraid to breathe. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The sound of the sea outside, the slow rhythm of waves against the shore, was the only reminder that the world still moved beyond these walls. Perseus turned slowly, his steps echoing across the marble floor. Every statue seemed to watch him, accusing and silent. He had ended tyranny, yes, but at what cost? His fingers trembled around the satchel. The head inside no longer hissed or pulsed. It lay still, as if content, as though its purpose had been fulfilled once more. Yet the silence it left behind felt wrong. Too deep, too knowing. Andromeda approached him at last, her voice barely a whisper. "You did what you had to," she said, though her eyes betrayed uncertainty. Perseus didn't answer. He thought of the island again, of Medusa's gaze softening in reflection before the blade fell, of the sadness that lingered in her features even in death. Each time he used her power, the line between justice and vengeance blurred a little more. He wondered if the gods were watching, laughing at their champion turned executioner. The marble figures glowed faintly under the torchlight, each one a mirror of the divine cruelty that had birthed this story. Perseus exhaled slowly, the sound hollow in the vast chamber. She was not the monster they said she was, he murmured at last. She was made into one. Andromeda looked at him, her expression unreadable. Perhaps she understood, or perhaps she could not. He wrapped the head once more in its cloth and stepped outside. The night air hit him like cold water, and for a moment he could almost hear Medusa's voice again, soft, distant, and resigned. "Now you see." The waves below whispered the same truth, breaking endlessly against the shore, as though erasing every name, every story, every trace of the living. The days after the fall of Polydex were strangely quiet. Perseus and Andromeda left Seriphos behind, the island shrinking into the horizon, its palace forever silent, an empty monument to pride and consequence. But the silence followed them. Even as they sailed across calm waters, the satchel at Perseus's side seemed to hum faintly, like a heartbeat buried under layers of fabric. He knew he could not carry it forever. The power within it was too great, too dangerous. It did not belong to him, nor to any mortal. And so, guided by dreams he suspected were sent by Athena herself, he set his course for the Acropolis. The journey was long, crossing islands where myths were born and forgotten. Along the way, whispers spread of the hero who carried the Gorgon's head. Some called him a savior, others a thief who had stolen death from the gods. When he finally reached the temple of Athena, dawn had just begun to burn gold across the marble columns. The air was cool, filled with the soft hum of bees and the rustle of olive trees. Perseus knelt before the great statue of the goddess, her stone eyes calm and distant. "I bring you what was once yours," he said quietly. From the satchel, he lifted the head, still beautiful, still tragic. The serpents, though lifeless, looked almost at peace, their coils frozen mid. Even Athena seemed to regard it with something close to pity. She descended from the shadows, her armor glinting faintly, her voice calm but edged with divine distance. "You have done well, son of Zeus," she said. "The curse is ended." But Perseus hesitated. "Ended?" he asked. "Or simply passed on?" Athena said nothing. Her hand reached out, touching the head gently, and for a moment the temple filled with a faint hum, as though Medusa's memory lingered between them. Then, with a single motion, Athena lifted the head high and set it upon her shield, the aegis where it would serve as a warning for ages to come. The power of the Gorgon would not fade, it would simply change form, transformed from curse to symbol. Perseus bowed his head, but as he turned to leave, a chill ran through him. He could almost feel eyes watching him from within the shield, not angry, not vengeful, but eternally awake. In the centuries that followed, the image of Medusa did not fade into silence, it multiplied. The head that once belonged to a mortal woman now adorned the armor of a goddess, carved into temples, pressed into coins, and painted upon shields that marched into war. Her face, frozen between beauty and terror, became a language all its own. To some, it was protection. To others, it was a warning, but always, it was power. Inside Athena's temple, the shield hung high above the altar. a glimmering circle that seemed to catch the light even when the torches burned low. Pilgrims came from distant lands just to see it, whispering prayers beneath their breath, unsure whether they were invoking the goddess or the Gorgon. Priests claimed that on stormy nights, the serpents etched into the metal seemed to stir, the faintest sound of scales brushing against bronze echoing through the corridors. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps not. The aegis was more than a weapon, it was a reminder. Every time Athena went to battle, the head of Medusa rode with her, gleaming in the sunlight like a mirror that reflected both triumph and tragedy. Enemies who met her gaze through that shield spoke of vision's fields turning to stone, their limbs stiffening before the strike ever came. Yet even among the Greeks, there were those who wondered whether Athena's triumph had truly been her own. Some poets whispered that the Gorgon's soul still lingered, restless, within the shield's shining surface, that her eyes once cursed to destroy had become eternal sentinels guarding the goddess herself. They said that when Athena looked into the polished bronze, she saw not only her reflection but the faint outline of another woman behind Hercum, sorrowful, eternal. Over time, the image of Medusa spread far beyond temples or myth. Merchants stamped her likeness onto coins for good fortune. Warriors painted her face upon their armor, believing her to be an omen of invincibility. Even homes bore her mark, carved into doorways and mosaics to ward off evil from entering. The woman once condemned to solitude became the silent guardian of an entire civilization. And yet, as her legend spread, so did the question that lingered in the quiet spaces of the night. Had she truly been defeated? Or had she simply changed the way she watched the world? Long after Athena's temples had turned to ruins and her worship faded into myth, the face of Medusa endured. It stared from broken pediments and cracked pottery, from coins unearthed beneath centuries of dust. Even as time eroded the names of kings and gods, her gaze remained unchanged, unblinking. Archaeologists who brushed sand from her stone likeness often spoke of a strange feeling that crept over them, a stillness, as if the air itself paused when her eyes emerged from the earth. Some laughed it off. Others, quietly, would cover her face again before nightfall. In the ancient world, few symbols had carried such paradox. Medusa was death and protection, fear and sanctuary. Soldiers wore her on their armor, yet mothers hung her image above their children's beds. Across city-states and centuries, her name was invoked not as a monster, but as a charm against monsters. The Greeks called this magic apotropaic, the power to turn evil away by confronting it with something more terrible. To ward off chaos, one must look chaos in the eye. Even as empires rose and fell, this idea endured. In Rome, artisans carved her face into doorways and fountains. In Byzantium, her likeness watched from mosaics beneath the feet of emperors. In every age, her gaze seemed to reappear, adapted, softened, yet always there. Some said she had transcended her myth, becoming something closer to a universal truth, that beauty and terror, life and death, can dwell in the same face. And perhaps that was why she never slept. She lingered not as a curse, but as a mirror, reflecting back the world's fear, its vanity, its violence. Even now, her story whispers beneath the marble and dust, beneath museums and cities that walk upon her buried temples. When you look upon her image, those wide eyes, those serpentine locks, it is said that part of her still sees you, not with malice, but with the calm of one who has seen too much, punished too deeply, and outlasted even the gods who condemned her. She became the watcher of history, the symbol that survived its own destruction. And as centuries turned to millennia, The question changed from who was Medusa to something far quieter. Why does she still watch us? They say that somewhere beyond the known Aegean, beneath waters that shift like sheets of glass, lies a temple that once belonged to Medusa herself. Divers who have descended near its rumored coordinates speak of carved stone faces peering through coral, of serpentine columns wrapped in seaweed like living vines. The water grows colder there, unnaturally still, and equipment sometimes fails without explanation. No one has ever stayed long. Some return with stories of mirrored surfaces on the seabed, shimmering like Athena's shield, reflecting not their own faces, but another's. Others emerge shaken, claiming they heard faint hissing beneath the water, as though something ancient still breathed between the stones. Historians dismiss these tales, suggesting the ruins are likely part of a forgotten coastal city, swallowed by earthquakes and tides. But local fishermen tell a different story, that the sea itself remembers her, that her temple sank not by chance, but by the will of the gods who feared her power would never truly die. They whisper that each year, during the stillest nights of summer, a faint glow rises from beneath the waves, ghostly green light that pulses like a heartbeat. Some believe it's the reflection of moonlight on marble, others that it's the serpents stirring in their eternal sleep, waiting for her return. The ocean, they say, is the perfect place to hide a gaze that could turn the world to stone. The temple beneath the waves has become a symbol for what endures unseen, what the world tries to bury but never can. In its depths lies not just the story of Medusa, but the echoes of every myth that speaks of beauty turned to curse, of power that refuses to fade quietly. Even now, when ships drift too close to that silent expanse, their instruments sometimes flicker, and the sea around them turns an uncanny shade of grey, as though the water itself remembers the island once surrounded by statues, the hero who came by air, and the gaze that could end all things. Perhaps the temple still stands, because it was never meant to be found, because some legends are not resting places, but warnings, and somewhere, far below, the ocean still guards her secret, keeping watch for those who dare to look down. In certain corners of Greece, particularly on the islands that still carry ruins older than memory, travelers speak of statues that seem almost alive. They stand among olive trees and broken pillars, faces worn smooth by centuries of wind, yet their expressions carry a strange serenities that seem to know. Some villagers call them the Whispering Ones. When the air is still and the cicadas quiet, you can almost hear a sound among them, like a low breath moving between stone lips. Scholars call it imagination wind funneling through cracks, an echo from the cliffs, but others claim it's a remnant of Medusa's gaze, the faintest hum of consciousness frozen in marble. They say these statues were once men who came to hunt her, mercenaries and priests blinded by promise of gold or glory. And when they met her eyes, their final thought was not fear but realization, that she was not the monster they imagined, but a mirror of their own cruelty, their own hunger for dominance over what they could not understand. Now they stand silent in eternal reflection, guardians of her truth, scattered across the landscape like ancient witnesses. Travelers who wander too close sometimes feel dizzy, as if time itself pauses around them. A few have sworn that the statues change positions when unobserved, that one might lift a hand or tilt its face toward the sea, as though listening. Villagers leave offerings at their feet, olive oil, shells, and small polished stones, not in worship, but in respect, because even now they believe the spirit of Medusa watches through them, not in vengeance, but in warning. to remind the living that what is called monster often begins as a victim, and that beauty and danger, like stone and breath, are never truly separate. The whispering statues are more than relics. They are echoes of conscience, frozen moments of transformation. Whether born of myth or memory, they remind those who pass that some curses are not meant to punish, but to preserve, to keep alive a story that must never be forgotten. For every whisper of wind that brushes across their faces is a voice repeating one truth: beware the eyes that see too deeply. For they do not just petrify flesh, they reveal the soul beneath far to the west of Greece. Past where most sailors dare to travel, there is talk of an island that does not appear on any modern map. It's small, shrouded in mist, and its coastline is said to hum softly at night like a distant lullaby carried on the wind. Locals from nearby ports call it the Island of Forgotten Echoes. Few claim to have stepped upon it, and those who have tell stories that sound more like dreams than voyagers. They describe beaches made not of sand but of pale, powdered stones, so fine it clings to your skin like ash. The air is warm but heavy, filled with the faint scent of salt and something older, something almost metallic. The waves that touch the shore don't crash, they sigh, like they're exhaling a secret they've held for centuries. At the island's center lies a grove of petrified trees, each one smooth as marble, their branches twisted into gestures that seem almost human. When the wind moves through them, the sound it makes is eerily familiar, soft voices calling names that no one remembers. Some say this is the final resting place of those who once sought Medusa, their echoes trapped in the stone as eternal reminders of what happens when curiosity crosses into arrogance. Others whisper that the island is not a graveyard but a reflection, a shadow of her old home, recreated by the gods as a monument to the tragedy they caused. The sea around it is unnaturally calm, like a mirror that hides what lies beneath. Sailors who pass too close report hearing faint laughter drifting across the water, followed by silence so absolute it feels alive. Instruments fail, compasses spin, and sometimes ships drift for hours before realizing they've moved nowhere at all. They say if you stand in the center of the grove at dusk, when the sky burns with gold, you can hear the faintest whisper Medusa's voice, repeating the same question again and again: who am I now that they've forgotten me? The answer never comes, only the echo of waves against stone, soft and endless, like time itself mourning what it cannot change. The island of forgotten echoes remains uncharted, unreachable, and yet, somehow, always near, appearing in dreams, in myths, in the quiet spaces between memory and fear. Every myth, no matter how ancient, carries a reflection of those who told it, and the story of Medusa is no exception. For centuries, her image was reshaped by the eyes of gods and men, until the truth beneath her face was buried beneath layers of fear and desire. The Greeks believed the eyes of the gods could see everything past, present, and what lay hidden within the soul. To be seen by them was a blessing and a curse. But Medusa's gaze reversed that power. It was mortal, yet divine. Cursed by Athena, yes, but in that curse, she inherited a vision that mirrored the god's own sight. She could see through pretense, through the masks of purity and power that Olympus wore so proudly. Her eyes were not just weapons, they were truth made unbearable. Perhaps that was the real reason the gods condemned her, not because she turned men to stone, but because she turned their lies to dust. When Perseus presented her severed head to Athena, the goddess placed it upon her shield, the aegis knot, to honor her, but to wield her truth as a warning. The eyes of Medusa became the eyes of the gods once more, a tool of control disguised as protection. Yet something about that act feels incomplete, doesn't it? As though Athena, in her divine wisdom, knew she could not destroy Medusa's power, only redirect it. In every temple carving, in every shield or amulet, her eyes still stare outward, unblinking. Some say the gods feared that if mortals ever looked into those eyes without turning to stone, they would finally see Olympus for what it truly was, the theater of cruelty draped in gold. And so, Medusa's image was twisted, turned into a monster's mask to frighten children and glorify heroes. But behind that mask, her gaze remains eternal, untamed. Even now, when archaeologists unearth her likeness on broken pottery or temple walls, those hollow eyes seem to follow the viewer. Not in malice, but in recognition, as if asking, "Do you see me yet?" The gods may have stolen her sight, but they could never blind her story. Because, in the end, her eyes do not belong to Olympus. They belong to everyone who has ever been silenced, transformed, or misunderstood and dared to look back. When Perseus carried Medusa's severed head from her cave, he carried more than a trophy, he carried a paradox. From her neck, 2 rivers of blood flowed, one dark and deadly, the other bright and filled with life. The ancient poets wrote that from the moment her head fell, 2 creatures sprang forth, Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, the warrior born of gold, both children of Poseidon, both born from the wound that ended her. In that moment, death gave birth to creation beauty, to terror, and terror to wonder. But there was something else in that blood, something older and stranger. The ancients said that drops of Medusa's blood could both kill and cure. The blood from her left side was venomous, it brought instant death. But the blood from her right side had the power to revive, to restore life where none should remain. Apollo himself was said to have used it to bring the dead back from the underworld, defying the balance of nature. And perhaps that was the deeper curse of Medusa, not the gaze that turned flesh to stone, but the essence that made gods uneasy. Her blood carried both endings and beginnings, chaos and salvation intertwined. Some philosophers later suggested that this duality was symbolic of the 2 halves of human nature itself, that within every soul lies both the power to destroy and to heal, and Medusa was simply the mirror that made us see it. The ancients feared her because she embodied what the gods could not control, the unpredictable force of transformation. The temples that once honored Athena often kept small vials or carvings shaped, like drops of blood, tokens of protection and peril. Those who knew the legend understood what they meant, that even in death Medusa's power flowed uncontainable. Some myths even whisper that her head continued to bleed long after it was severed, that each drop became a serpent, slithering into the sea, turning coral red where they fell. They say that's why the Mediterranean's reefs pulse with crimson to this day, a quiet echo of the blood that refused to fade, whether as poison or medicine, destruction or creation. Her blood remains the ultimate truth of her story, that every ending conceals a birth, and every curse hides the possibility of grace. There is a legend whispered among Greek shepherds about a place few dare to enter, the caves of reflection. Hidden within the cliffs of the Aegean, they are said to twist deep beneath the earth, their walls covered in crystals so smooth they act like mirrors. Travelers who've stumbled inside claim that the reflections are never quite right. When you raise your hand, the image moves a second too late. When you turn your head, your reflection continues staring forward, unblinking. Some say the caves, were formed from the same stone that lined Medusa's lair, the very walls that watched her isolation and wept with her. Over time, the sorrow and fury of her spirit seeped into the rock, giving the caves a strange awareness, as though the earth itself remembers her story. Explorers who ventured too deep into the labyrinth claim they saw not their own faces in the crystal, but hers eyes closed, calm, surrounded by the faint whisper of serpents moving through the dark. And if you linger long enough, they say you begin to hear voices soft, measured, and ancient. Not curses, but questions. Why did they fear what they made? Why do you look without seeing? Those who return from the caves of reflection rarely speak of what they saw, but those who do always share one strange similarity. Their eyes seem distant, as if they've glimpsed something too profound to describe. Historians dismiss these tales as superstition, explaining the illusions as light distortion or mineral reflection. But the locals know better. They claim the caves are sacred and unintentional shrine to Medusa's memory, a space where mortals confront not monsters, but themselves. Each reflection, they say, shows not your form, but your truth, your hidden anger, your silent grief, your capacity for both cruelty and compassion. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Medusa, not the curse that turns men to stone, but the reflection that forces them to face what they are. When the wind moves through the tunnels, it hums a low, mournful tune like the hiss of serpents, or perhaps the sigh of the earth remembering. And deep within, in the dark where mirrors breathe, her spirit endures, not in rage, but in quiet understanding. The gaze no longer petrifies. It awakens, somewhere between myth and memory. There exists a dream that scholars and mystics alike have spoken of, a recurring vision known as the dream of stone and sea. Those who have it describe a vast ocean stretching endlessly under a silver sky. In its center stands a single figure, a woman with serpents for hair, standing ankle-deep in water that mirrors the heavens. Around her are shapes beneath the surface, statues resting on the seafloor, their outlines blurred by the current. The woman does not move, yet her reflection ripples as though alive, whispering words the dreamer cannot fully understand. Each retelling is the same: silence, reflection, and the feeling of being both observer and observed. Ancient philosophers believed this dream was a visitation from Medusa herself, fragment of her consciousness reaching through time, speaking in symbols rather than speech. Others saw it as a metaphor, a meeting between the mortal mind and the eternal. But perhaps it is more personal. Perhaps the dream of stone and sea is how the world remembers her, how her sorrow seeps through the edges of sleep to remind us that her story was never just about fear. In the dream, the sea glows, faintly green and goldened. The statues beneath the water are not men frozen in horror, but faces at peace. Their expressions are calm, almost grateful, as if they have been released from the noise of the world. The longer one dreams, the more the water rises, until it covers everything: the statues, the sky, the dreamer leaving only a sense of stillness, of weightless quiet. When people awaken, they describe the same lingering emotion, not terror, but sadness, a soft ache for something that feels both lost and alive. Some awaken with tears on their cheeks. Others claim to taste salt on their lips. In ancient mystery cults, initiates prayed to have the dream of stone and sea before taking vows of silence or transformation. They believed that to dream it was to be touched by her essence, to see the boundary between mortal fragility and divine endurance. And though centuries have passed, some still dream it today. They wake knowing what the ancients feared to admit, that the sea still remembers her name, and that the stone beneath it still dreams of being flesh once more. When Perseus severed Medusa's head, he did not destroy her, he merely carried her power into a new chapter of myth. The head, still alive and potent, became an object of divine fear and fascination. The ancients called it the Gorgonion, a relic both sacred and forbidden. It was said that even after her death, Medusa's eyes retained their dreadful beauty half closed, but glimmering faintly as if dreaming. The head was not buried or burned. Instead, it was carried by Perseus across lands and seas, and wherever he went, misfortune followed. Crops failed. Animals fled from the sound of his footsteps. Storms brewed over calm water. He began to understand that what he held was not a trophy, but a living curse. Some say that after he used it to turn King Poedex and his court to stone, Perseus could no longer bear the weight of it, the faint whispers that came from the satchel at night, the rustle of unseen serpents. Others claim that he would speak to it when alone, hearing a voice replying not cruel, but calm, almost maternal. "You cannot outrun what you've taken," it would say. The myths differ on what happened next. In one, Perseus presented the head to Athena, and she placed it on her shield, the aegis to terrify her enemies and remind the world of divine justice. In another, he buried it deep within the earth, somewhere near Lake Tritonus, believing the soil would quiet its power. But neither tale feels complete. There are later accounts, forgotten by most, that tell of a secret order known as the Keepers of the Head, priests and priestesses who guarded the relic in silence, believing that its gaze still held a divine balance, the power to destroy tyranny as easily as it punished arrogance. They never revealed its location, only that it rests where no reflection can reach it, where even the gods would not dare to look. The Gorgonion became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of the duality that governs all life, creation and destruction, intertwined in one immortal face. Some say the keepers still exist, their lineage unbroken, guarding the relic beneath the ruins of a forgotten temple. And if that's true, then somewhere in the quiet heart of the earth, Medusa still watches, her eyes open in the dark, waiting for the world to remember what it turned away from, the truth that even in death she was never defeated. Long after Perseus and Athena faded into legend, a city rose along the coast of what is now Western Anatolia, place once devoted to Athena's worship. Marble temples, towering colonnades, and golden statues reflected her glory. Yet beneath all that splendor lingered an unspoken unease. The city was called Lithia, and it prided itself on wisdom, art, and divine favor. But its people lived with a strange fear. No mirrors were allowed within its walls. No polished bronze, no pools deep enough to reflect the sky. The citizens said it was out of reverence for the gods, an act of humility. But travelers whispered that Lithia was cursed, that its founders had stolen sacred relics from a shrine, once dedicated to Medusa, long before Athena claimed her story. The relic's 3 stone fragments, carved with the shape of serpents, were buried beneath the city's main square. From that day on, reflection itself became dangerous. Those who caught their own faces in water or metal swore they saw not themselves, but another image staring back, a woman with green eyes, her gaze heavy with sorrow, as though silently pleading to be seen. The priests called her a demon, and the city passed laws forbidding any reflective surface. Over generations, the people forgot why. They built fountains without basins, windows without glass, and statues that faced the sea but never the sun. Lithia became known as the city that looked away. It prospered, yes, but always with an undercurrent of dread, as if its walls were listening. Then, one year, an earthquake struck. The ground split open near the old square, revealing a chamber beneath. Inside lay a perfectly preserved mosaic of a woman's face serpents curling round her head, eyes closed in eternal calm. The workers who uncovered it claimed to feel the air shift, heavy and still, like the moment before a storm. By morning, the mosaic had vanished. The chamber filled itself with stone and dust, sealing as though it had never been. Lithia fell soon after, not by invasion or fire, but by silence. The people simply left, abandoning their city to the wind. Now it lies in ruins, its name nearly forgotten. But divers who swim near its sunken remains say the water there is so clear it reflects everything except your own face. And if you stare long enough, you might see hers, watching still. On quiet nights, when the moon hangs low over the Aegean, there is a sound the fishermen know well, a faint, rhythmic hiss that drifts across the water like wind through reeds. They call it the serpent's lullaby. It comes without warning, sometimes near the islands, sometimes far out at sea. Nets tear, lights flicker, the air grows still, and for a moment, every ripple on the ocean's surface turns glassy, as though something vast moves beneath. Most dismiss it as superstition, a sailor's tale meant to explain the sea's restless moods. But older generations speak differently. They say it's her the whisper of Medusa's serpents, singing in the dark, calling across time to remind the world she was once alive. The lullaby is soft, almost soothing. Those who hear it describe feeling drowsy, calm, as though the water itself were humming them to sleep. Yet behind that calmness lies unease. The sound carries rhythm, almost language tones that rise and fall like breath, patterns that repeat with eerie precision. Scientists have recorded the noise on deep-sea instruments, calling it a natural resonance caused by volcanic vents or shifting currents. But the recordings never play back quite right. On each one, faint underneath the static, are words, not Greek, not human, but something that feels like speech. Sailors who hear it too long claim to dream of her afterward, Medusa, standing on the surface of the sea, her hair moving gently in the wind, her eyes kind, almost sorrowful. In the dreams, she does not speak. She only hums that same melody, soft as the tide. Some awaken crying, others filled with peace they can't explain. In certain coastal villages, mothers still hum that tune to their children, believing it keeps them safe from drowning. They say the serpent's song, though born of pain, became a prayer for those lost to the waves, a promise that no soul would drift unseen. And perhaps that's the truth hidden beneath the legend, that even cursed voices can become comfort. Even monstrous sounds can carry mercy. The serpent's lullaby is not a warning, it's a remembrance. A song that binds stone and sea, death and tenderness, into something eternal. The sea remembers her, and when the world grows silent enough, it still sings her to sleep, in the ruins of an abandoned temple near Delphi. Archaeologists once uncovered something extraordinary, colossal marble relief of Medusa's face, half buried beneath layers of soil and broken tile. Unlike the usual depictions of the Gorgon Fang's flaring eyes, a grimace of rage, this one was serene. Her lips curved faintly upward, as if in forgiveness. Her eyes, though unseeing, conveyed neither threat nor sorrow. They looked human. The discovery baffled scholars. The carving dated to a time when Medusa was already branded as a monster, centuries after her story had hardened into myth. Why then would an artist sculpt her with such grace? Some believe it was an act of rebellion, a sculptor who saw through the fear, daring to show the woman the world erased. Others whisper that the artist was guided by visions, that the marble itself revealed her image, forming naturally in the stone before tools ever touched it. What unsettled the researchers most was what lay behind the relief. When the stone slab was moved, the ground beneath pulsed faintly with heat. They recorded low vibrations, like a heartbeat. No source was found, and days later, the sound vanished. The temple was closed for restoration, but those who had worked there began to dream of her face, always the same expression, calm, waiting, alive. One of the team, a linguist, reported hearing her name in his sleep, spoken like a sigh carried through sand. Medusa, the protector. That was her name before fear reshaped it. The marble face, though damaged by centuries, still holds a strange energy. Visitors say the air around it feels dense, charged. Some claim that if you stand before it long enough, you can sense movement beneath the surface, as though the stone were breathing. The curators keep it under glass now, guarded day and night, not out of superstition, they insist, but respect. Yet those who've seen it in person describe leaving with the same feeling, that the carving isn't merely a relic, but a message, a quiet defiance against the myths that vilified her. Perhaps the sculptor understood something the world forgot, that truth, like beauty, can be buried but never destroyed. And somewhere within that marble still lies her reflection, waiting for eyes brave enough to meet it without fear. They say when the wind moves through the ruins of Sarpedon's coast, it carries a sound unlike any other, a faint hiss, rhythmic and low, like the stirring of sand through serpent scales. Locals call it the whisper of stone. Some dismiss it as coincidence, a trick of geography and wind, but those who've stood there at dusk speak differently. They say it feels alive, as though the land itself remembers something. Here, centuries ago, a shrine once stood, an unmarked place of worship dedicated not to the Olympians, but to older, quieter powers. Offerings of seashells, olive oil, and small mirrors have been found buried there, arranged in patterns that resemble coiled snakes and radiant suns. Archaeologists catalogued them, puzzled by the mixture of fear and reverence in these objects. They called it a cult of protection. But among the fragments of pottery and the cracked mosaics, one inscription stood out, etched in ancient Greek, "To she who sees, but does not speak." The meaning is hauntingly ambiguous. Some scholars connect it to early Gorgon worship, before the myths of punishment and heroism rewrote her into a monster. Others see in it a broader theme, a reverence for silence, for stillness, for forces that watch but do not interfere. Yet, for those who have lingered in that place, the silence does speak. They describe hearing a faint hum beneath their feet, a vibration like the breath of something vast and sleeping below. It is said that when lightning strikes nearby, the air tastes of metal, and for a heartbeat, all sound disappears. A shepherd once claimed that during one such storm, he saw her outline appear in the cliff face, hair twisting, eyes closed, as though the mountain itself had taken on her shape. Scientists found no evidence of this, yet when they tested the rock, they discovered an unusual mineral composition, traces of serpentine, the same stone ancient sculptors used to carve protective amulets. It is as though the land itself had absorbed her myth and turned it to memory. Even now, travelers leave offerings, their small mirrors, fresh water, or handfuls of sea salt, tokens of respect to the one who watches but never judges. Whether it's the echo of an ancient faith or something deeper that stirs within the stone, no one can say. But when the wind rises and the whisper returns, it feels like she's still there, guarding, waiting, remembering. And so we arrive at the end of her story, or perhaps the beginning that never ended. Medusa's gaze, once feared as a curse, has outlived gods, temples, and empires. The world that condemned her has turned to dust. Yet her image endures into stone, painted on pottery, carved into coins, and whispered in dreams. There's something timeless in that stare. It doesn't glare, it doesn't rage, it holds, steady, unflinching, like the eyes of the sea itself. Maybe that's what the ancients truly feared, not her power to kill, but her power to see through illusion, through pretense, through the fragile masks of divinity and man. The petrifying gaze wasn't just magic, it was revelation. It forced mortals to face what they were, fleeting, mortal, trembling before forces older than memory. In that sense, Medusa wasn't the destroyer of life, but the mirror of it. The final reminder that everything that breathes will someday become still, and that in stillness there is truth. Across time, artists and philosophers tried to capture this paradox. From Athena's shield to Caravaggio's canvas, from temple pediments to modern screens, her face has shifted, but the feeling it evokes remains unchanged. A pull between beauty and terror, pity and power, sleep and awakening. Even now, psychologists write of the Medusa effect, a term describing that instinctive paralysis between fascination and fear. Yet perhaps the truer meaning lies deeper. She was never meant to be a monster of nightmares, but a guardian of thresholds, the last line between chaos and creation, seen and unseen, mortal and divine. Some myths say that when Perseus placed her head upon Athena's shield, the goddess didn't wield it to destroy, but to protect sacred order. Others whisper that after her death, Medusa's spirit returned to the sea, her serpents dissolving into waves, her eyes becoming stars that shimmer faintly on moonless nights. If you've ever stared into the dark ocean at midnight and felt something looking back, not hostile, not kind, simply aware that maybe her gaze still watching, not to curse, but to remind us that what we fear often carries wisdom, and that beneath every myth of monsters lies a story about misunderstood power. So as you drift into sleep, imagine her not as the creature turned to legend, but as the silence between tides, the guardian of dreams, the protector of boundaries, the eternal watcher beneath the waves.